Already. Yeah, we are live. So this is lesson 5 of the Power App saga for the Zero to Hero mentorship. This is by far the coolest lesson name of them all. I had a boring title for my lesson, and I think Chris, with the data first, maybe it was more scientific, but this is by far the coolest title for lessons that we've seen so far. Geetha, thank you so much for being here, for donating your time and your knowledge to us. Floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks for having me. I am super excited to be meeting and seeing new faces in here and to be able to share and talk all things Power Apps.
Awesome.
I will go ahead and start my screen share. Does that come through all right?
It's coming up. Yeah, got it.
All right. So today we are going to be looking at some really cool Power App-licious tips and tricks. And I have my top 10 tips and tricks that you can use to make your apps pop. And also you do want to incorporate everything that you've learned since the beginning of the Power App Saga sessions that Victor's put together. But we'll try and touch on each of them as we go through our tips and tricks here. Quick introduction to myself. I am a solutions architect and a Power Platform technical lead at Artist Consulting, a Microsoft partner based out of Dallas, Texas. I'm also a power addict, passionate about all things Azure, Office 365, AI, and of course, the Power Platform. I'm also the founder for the Dallas Fort Worth Power Apps and Power Automate user group. We are virtual, so if any of you are interested in joining us and learning more about the platform, networking with your peers in the space, feel free to join us. And those are my links out there. You feel free to follow me. I'm always happy to help in the best way I can. And I often try to share trials and tribulations that I've had with the platform. And today we are going to look at those tips to make your Canvas app designs pop. And quick disclaimer here, I do not come from a web design background, but I wanted to use this opportunity to share things that I've learned along the way when it comes to app UI UX. I've also categorized my tips in an easy way to remember, an acronym POWER, and then we're going to look at a few tricks under each tip in the essence of time. We could have a whole session on each tip there, but we're going to try and cover as much as we can. All right, our first tip there is plan ahead. That comes with the first letter P. So let's talk about the colors that translate to your app branding. You want to think about primary and secondary colors as your base colors for your UI. And primary colors are the colors that are used most frequently in your UI, which could be based on your company branding. Standard design recommendations are to have no more than 3 primary colors. Secondary colors are optional, but it's always good to have some accent colors that help you emphasize your UI elements, such as buttons and progress bars. You do want to make sure those colors complement and contrast each other. And we're going to take a look at a couple of tools that you can use if you don't know on the top of your head how to come up with those contrasting and complementing colors, or also if your company doesn't have a proper branding or a consistent look and feel, and if you want to be the one that's going to be introducing that, we'll look at a couple of tools as an example of how you can go grab some color schemes. And then there's also the concept of having neutral colors. That would be mostly for your backgrounds. And so the rest of your elements on your applications pop up. So you do want to make sure that they are readable when it comes to text, and then also are in compliance with any accessibility guidelines, which we will dive a little into in one of our tips there. I do have a couple of links there that I normally use when I have to go get an inspiration, or if I want to go look at what the trends are today with app building. Those are really cool links out there. One is Material Design. It's a design system created by Google. That helps teams build high quality digital experiences like for Android, iOS, for the web. That's definitely a good read if you want to get a 101 on what it means to build a color system for your application. And then, of course, there are several templates out there that Microsoft has put out. You do have the customer success template. That's one of my favorite templates, and also the meetings app. Those are a good ways to get inspirations from. and look at how others have built the app, and then try and see pieces that apply to your use case, and pick them apart and then extend them as needed. One other thing I do want to call out on the screenshot that you see on the right there, that I call it the Power App style sheet. So if you are familiar with the terminology CSS, that stands for Cascading Style Sheet, and you will see that being used a lot in web design. It is a set of styles that can be applied to controls and elements on your screen, and that's how regular web programming works. And that concept is applicable for Power Apps as well. So a good practice would be to have your color scheme specified at the on start of your app as a global variable. So that way you have a standardized set of colors and styles that will flow through your application on each control. And the next time you have a change, let's say your company branding, they changed the primary color, you wouldn't have to go to each control to change the color. You could just change it on your app start, and it should just trickle through. So that's a quick tip there to make sure that you do start thinking about that as a first step when you start building your applications. All right, next tip here is on typography. That's a new terminology for you, nothing to be intimidated about. It just involves your font style, the appearance and structure, just aiming to convey specific messages to the end user. It's so much more than just choosing a nice font for your website. It's an art of using typefaces to bring your interface to life. So with so much to consider when working with typography, you do want to keep a couple of things in mind. You want to include readability, depending whether it's the color of the text you use or whether it's the size of the text you use. You want to make sure that it's accessible, so your apps are accessible by all of our friends and your peers and in your network. And then you want to make sure that the typography marks a good difference between a good interface and a great interface. You don't want to use too many fonts. Keep in mind that the goal of creating a hierarchy is clarity. So the best practice would be to keep it to 3 fonts for one design. That's usually the safe standards, but if you want to go lesser than that, that's totally fine. But when it comes to color, consider not just the font color, but also the background colors that come into play, so that any text that you have will pop out. Oftentimes when you build apps, you might hear phrases like, "Oh, the text is too big here," or "the words are placed too distantly." These are some comments that you want to avoid. So for that, these are some tips here that you can use. 16 pixel is a good place to start when you're wanting to have a default font size. And then your secondary sizes, your secondary fonts, any text that is going to be complementary to your primary text can be about 1 or 2 font sizes smaller than your body text. So that way they know or get context around what's the primary intent of that text as a headliner, and then your supporting text can be a little more smaller. And with users spending, considerable amount of time consuming information and interacting with words, it is really important to be careful when you craft that typography so that it is intuitive for anyone using the app. Going on to our next tip here, which would be optimal UI. We're moving on to our option of thinking outside the box. There's so much you can do by just thinking outside the box and stretching Power Apps to not look like how it does today, with how the controls work like today. There are a couple of other new features that have been introduced as well, like the Creator Kit, which we will touch on a little bit, just for you to know how you can incorporate fluent-based UI and controls within your applications. But I did want to call out one control that is you just don't want to underestimate. It's an underrated control, which is the HTML control. It gives you a lot of flexibility to power up your app designs. There are several things you can do with that control. You can define inline styles. You are not able to write classes above your HTML content. That's not available today, but you are able to align inline styles, like come up with your own HTML text that has a control, say a div tag, and then type in your inline styles that you would want to dictate how that appearance of that specific control needs to be like, and so it doesn't impact any other controls on the page. There are a couple of other things that you can't do today, which is you cannot have out of the box animation. You don't have the concept of doing pseudo classes. A pseudo class is usually used to define like a special state of an element, like for example, mouse over, or you want to have a custom scroll bar. All of that would require a pseudo class, and that's not possible today. But just with what's available today, you are able to do a lot and stretch your power apps to go, beyond the native look of how those controls look. So that screenshot that you see there is the PTO app that I first experimented with using HTML control. And we will take a look at that app just to see how it's, just pick apart some of those controls to see how the HTML content is built out. Now, if you are brand new to HTML and you have, no idea how to come up with the code for it, there are generators online. There is a resource down there at the bottom that I have, which is called the CSS generator. You are able to go, pick how you want your controls to look like, and it will generate the CSS for you, and you're able to plug that in into your app. So there's a lot you can do today. And then today you also have ChatGPT, so you could pretty much ask AI how you would want to build an HTML control and plug that in as well. But remember, all of the content that AI provides is just based on what's out there. There might still be some testing and trial and tribulations that you would want to do as you use content from AI. Now, let's talk about one really important facet of usability, which is accessibility. This is often overlooked, and I wanted to spend a little time talking really in detail about why it's important. We do have the responsibility to make sure that everyone has access to what we create, regardless of ability, context, or situation. So end of the day, we want to make sure that you give a better experience for everyone. And we've looked at a couple of tools like, material design, and then I'm gonna jump into a web browser and open up some tools to show you how you can come up with things. But when you do that, you also want to remember that they are WCAG compliant. WCAG stands for Web Content Access Guidelines. And then, there are two tricks here that I've highlighted in the screenshots. So let's talk a little bit about that. When you have a form and you're asking them to fill out few fields and you want to hit submit. Now, in this case, we have a project name, a client names, and then we're asking the user to hit submit. You do want to make sure the labels and tooltips have some call to action for those buttons and images. Like, for example, I only have text underneath that. But let's say, for example, we have a friend who is colorblind, for whom the red color may not pop out as much. It would help for them to have an icon, like a warning icon, which would speak to the context of why that warning is coming up. So that's just an example of how you could incorporate some accessibility compliant user experience within your application. Now, you do have the app checker within your Power App Studio. It does a great job of indicating controls that are missing accessible labels. You do not want to ignore them. You want to make sure that you add meaningful labels because that would help users with cognitive limitations or visual disabilities to avoid unnecessary keystrokes to visit content that is not relevant to them. And another usability pattern you want to, avoid specifying important information is just by color alone, and that's what we talked about on the screenshot. So it does help users with partial sight or color blindness to determine what's expected of them to continue using the app. There is a tool called Wave. It is an accessibility evaluation tool that's developed by an organization. If you have an interest in getting deeper into how this can be incorporated into your apps, I would highly recommend getting through the tool. It does give you visual feedback about the accessibility of your web content. It's a tool that you can run on your app, and then it'll tell you just what's wrong with your app. Or you could get more proactive where you decide how your color schemes need to be and what compliant colors to use or even font sizes to use when you determine your font scheme and color scheme as part of your app style sheet. That's just a quick tip there. I do have a couple of resources. Again, Material Design is a pretty good resource. And then you also have the Microsoft Theme Designer. I will open that up shortly to quickly show you how that's going to work. Let's go ahead and going to take a pause here and see if there are any questions or comments or feedback, anything that you would like to share before I move on to opening up the browser. All right, let's go ahead and pull up my browser here. Bear with me, trying to get that up. All right, so Coolers is a website that I normally use to generate color palettes, trending color palettes for me, or also if I want to come up with a color palette based on company branding. So when you go there, you could go explore trending palettes. That's one way to do it, or you could just start with a generator. I'm just going to let that load. And you have a bunch of color palettes already in here, so you can try and match it to your company branding, or you could come up with your own as well. I'm going to go ahead and pick this one right here. Let's go and look at the palette. And then now, you're able to copy hex codes if you want. You're also able to open up a color picker and change the colors as well. I'm going to go back and open one to start a generator so you can see how that works. So go ahead and start one. I do see a little bit of a lag in the on my screen, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera for a short bit, but I'll continue speaking through the screen share. All right, so this is a palette that was starting from scratch. So it just generated a color palette for me, but you could do the same with any of your picked color palettes as well. And you see there are a couple of options. You're able to drag, you're able to add a contrasting shades, you're able to view shades, you can pick a different shade. What I really like about this approach is once you have your colors picked, you are also able to check contrast. Like it tells you, black text is good on the screen, but white text it ain't gonna work. So things like that. That's at a very basic level. It does tell you how accessibility is going to work from a typography standpoint. But another favorite feature of mine is once that's done, you are able to export the palette. So what I normally do is export it as CSS. And then at the very bottom, you'll see that you have all of your colors in your hex code or on your RGB codes, and you're able to copy paste that into on your app start screen and start using it. So you really don't have to be an app designer to get your schemes right. You are able to just get inspiration, use templates and resources, and get started that way. I'm going to go ahead and move to another screen here. Let me see. So this is the other one that I wanted to talk about. This is the theme designer that Microsoft has out there for us to use. It's called the Fluent UI Theme Designer, and I had a link for it on the slide. You can see that it allows you to pick a primary color, a text color, then what your background color is. Kept it really simple. It's monochromatic, and it gives you a good overview of how your content on your screen is going to look like, including text, controls, buttons, any of those commonly used controls or user navigation items that you would use. It gives you a good overview of how that's going to look like. And then at the bottom, you do have an accessibility checker. So it does tell you what your contrast ratio looks like based on the selections you've made. And then it'll also tell you if you have any non-accessible pairs, it'll call that out for you. So you're able to make adjustments to how you would want to have your color scheme based on the accessibility ratios. So, and then at the bottom, you have a bunch of fabric palettes that you can use as well. You're able to look at a couple of variations that you would want to use. And another very useful feature here is you are able to export it. And when you export it, it does generate that palette for you. And you can pick and choose the ones that you don't want if you want to stick with primary and secondary and neutral colors. And then you're able to just grab that and reuse it in your apps. So this is something that you really want to try playing around with and see if that helps make your app making process quicker and easier. All right, I am going to now dive into the app example to see how you can use HTML controls just as a way for you to get excited about using that control and, trying new things. Let's go ahead and I'm going to go over to this app here. Now, I do have, just for the purpose of demo, I have a bunch of multi-section, tabbed controls here. What I'm going to do is go ahead and play it first. Let's go to my screen here. So here are a bunch of tabbed controls with different formats. There are a couple of designs that you could use, right? And all of this uses a combination of HTML control, even for the icons and a couple of things. But this just shows you that you are not limited to what Power Apps has to offer. You are able to use a combination of these controls to make it look a lot more modern and intuitive. So let's go take a look at one example here. I am going to open up the HTML text control here. This is an HTML text control, and I'm going to open up the Power Effects editor so you can see how we have those icons generated. There is the concept of Unicode characters in HTML, and there is a whole table out there. You don't have to remember these codes by heart, but it's a code that when HTML is rendered on a browser, it understands how to translate that into an image or an icon. And so that's what we have here. You have those check marks and those little icons, those pencil icons to indicate that that's you want to edit as an option for you to provide context to the end user on what action needs to be taken on those tabs. And so if you look at it, it's a pretty simple HTML control. It's a paragraph that I've started because I want to drop in some content in it. And then I have some inline styles, and I'm giving it a font size, and I'm saying my color is going to be white. And this is that Unicode character that translates into that check mark. So that is a very quick way to come up with icons, and it's pretty lightweight because you're not hosting images in your application and you're just using Unicode characters to generate imagery on the fly. So that's a quick example there. And then if you noticed, you are able to do that conditionally. So it's an HTML control, but it will flip what icon to show based on my status. So if it's completed, then I want to show the green, the white check mark there. And then if it's not completed, then I want to show the edit icon, and that's what that Unicode character is for. So that's just a quick example of how you'll notice that being used in a couple of other places as well. This is another example of how it's been used. It's pretty much a gallery, with the content listed out. And you look at the table, you'll notice that we have our colors listed out here, and then what my hex codes are, and then what my description is. And then I do have the icons getting generated automatically or logically based on the status. So let's go back to this one as well, so you can take a look at um, the control here. Yep. So if you look at it, we do have an HTML control here, and that little half circle that you see is also another HTML control. So we're using a div tag to specify what that half circle, what sizing it needs to be in, and how I want to change my radius. There is the concept of using a border radius, so you're able to have those curved edges on your controls or on the icon or the imagery that you're trying to generate with HTML. So this is an example of how you could do that. And then you'll see that I do have that being conditionally generated as well. It is using a green background if it's completed, and it's using a gold background, which essentially looks like yellow for the ones that are not completed. So that's just a quick way for you to get an idea of how you could use this control. I am going to go over to our app here, the My PTO app that I built, so I can show you a couple of other ways to use the control as well. So let me go ahead and maximize that a little bit. Now, let's take a look at this little donut chart here. What we have here is an SVG. This is not an image or a chart that I've uploaded, but I've generated that on the fly using SVGs. SVG stands for Scalar Vector Graphic. This is pretty lightweight on your apps as well. So if you have any complex charting or any imagery that you would want to use, you want conditional formatting or dynamically populating the value for it, you could look at SVGs as an option because it's very lightweight on your app. And what you see here is a donut chart, and I have the whole HTML content for that SVG loaded up here. And it is an image control that can take SVG content as an input. That's what I have filled out on the image property for that control. And I can conditionally set how much of the donut I want to, get filled in and how much of it I want to keep not filled out based on, in this case, I'm using my current PTO days versus days that have been approved to show me how many PTO days I have left. So that's the quick example of how you could use SVGs. And look, I am not an expert on SVGs either. I cannot write this code on the fly. I use online generators. There are several SVG generators online. There are several of these components that community folks have also put out as components that you can use. And you're also able to go to an online generator and tweak it to fit into your use case and grab that. And all you have to do is apply the right colors and then have that conditionally formatted the way you would want it to be. Now let's moving on to this next one here. This little box here, if you actually look at it, it's got a little bit of a shadow at the bottom. This kind of tells me that it's got that little 3D effect of making you feel like it's a button that I can actually click on. I'm going to go ahead and show you what that really is. It is a HTML control again. There is a property that you can use called box shadow, and there are a couple of values that you can fill in based on at what angle, how much of that shadow do you want it to be filled, at what part of that control you want to be filled. There's a bunch of things. I do have a link for a post that talks about in detail like what each property stands for, and so that would be a good read if you want to get started with using the HTML control to come up with some really cool ways to get the content out there on your apps. So here, one other thing I do want to point out is the border radius. We did look at that in the other example. That allows you to have those little curved edges that you see at the corners of these controls. And what I'm doing here is conditionally changing the color for the buttons itself based on what's selected. So for example, I have vacation selected by default and has the blue color. The rest of them are white. So if I go ahead and pick another one, it'll change colors. I do want to show you another one. I don't know if it's very clear for you, the contrast in the color, depending on the resolution that you're on. But there is a white shell outside of these buttons. Now, it doesn't have a box shadow, but that shell has curved edges, and we are using another HTML control as well. So it's another simple div tag with the border radius and just setting what my height and background color needs to be. So that way I can pop my buttons out, and it actually gives context to the user that, hey, here's your focus area on the screen, and here are where your call to action buttons are. All right, I think that, oh, one more thing. Another place that you'll notice at the top is my header area where we have the shadow at the bottom, box shadow at the bottom. So this also is a good way to give you that effect of popping out certain parts of your screen where it's necessary. Right, let's get back to our presentation here. I am going to go ahead and pull that out. Just looking at the chat here. Yes, Coolers is very cool. Yep, I fell in love with it the moment I looked at it. It's been very helpful in coming up with color schemes and generating those hex codes so I could just use them in the app. All right, bear with me. I'm trying to get over to my slides here. All right, we're going on to our next step. which would be effective and engaging UX. The number one top or item that I want to talk about is the Creator Kit. The Creator Kit, if you haven't heard of it before, it actually helps create your Power App experiences on the web and mobile platforms with components that are already packaged for you. The kit comes with a component library and several of the commonly used Power Apps component framework controls. There are code controls. There are also components that have been created using the Fluent UI based framework, and there are templates for you to use, and then also utilities that can increase your productivity as an app maker. So you already have reusable controls and components, and you're able to easily create consistent, beautiful, and effective user experiences for your custom business applications. If you are looking to use that, a couple of things for you to remember is you do want to, it's an installable kit, so you're able to go to that link, aka.ms/creator kit, and download the kit. And then you want to install your managed solutions. You're able to install them in your environments. But you do want to make sure that you have the Power Apps app code components for Canvas app feature enabled in your environment, and that is something a system admin can do, or that's a security role that's needed to be able to enable this feature. And then also for you to be able to use these components, you do want to have a system customizer security role, and then also any valid Power Apps license should work as long as you're able to create apps and build them in that environment. Just something to look out for when you want to use the Creator Kit. All right. We have a couple of tips under this section, which would be the effective and engaging UX. We talked about the Creator Kit. There is the text overlay option when coming to, having a more readable user interfaces. And before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about what the difference really is between UI and UX. You keep hearing this terminology UI, UX, but there is a difference between UI and UX, a big one. UI is what users see. That's how I remember it, and it's always easy to think of it that way. And UX is what users feel when they use your apps. So UX design mainly involves understanding your target audience, their pain points. You could have the most beautiful app built, but if your UX is not up to the mark, then your adoption is going to take a hit. Now, that doesn't mean UI is not critical. UX and UI are both critical components that can make or break your app. So they work really close together, and so the combination of UI and UX kind of decide how your app looks, functions, and feels. So let's take a look at two patterns to help enhance the user experience within your apps. Number one here is text overlay. It's become very popular to overlay text labels on background images. You'll see that a lot in a lot of your websites as well. You have these huge splash images on the background, and then you have text, overlaid on top of it. But the last thing you'd want is for your users to be straining to read such text. Now, this is all the more important on mobile apps because, there's much smaller real estate, and smaller the screen, smaller the text, it makes it a little hard to read. So one solution is to use a scrim. What scrim really is a semi-transparent layer that you can use to help text appear more readable against your backgrounds. Another solution is to overlay the whole image with a translucent layer. You could drop a rectangle control, and you could add, pick maybe black or gray, dark gray, and then change the transparency on it so that you have an overlay over the image, and then drop in your text on top of it. So that way, your text actually pops out. I don't think the screenshots here are doing justice to how the difference is. But if you look really close, the one on the right has a slightly darker background, and that's because we have the overlay on it. And then so that your text pops out and then it doesn't get, blended with your background image. So it's really straightforward to achieve your overlay solutions. And just think of the text overlay and then also the color overlay if you have a very busy image going on in the background. Just some couple of things for you to keep in mind when you're thinking of app UX. Moving on to our next tip here would be a fat finger friendly design. Now, this next tip is really important when it comes to touch-based interfaces. It's called the fat finger syndrome. Now, if you haven't heard of this term, trust me, it's real, it exists. This occurs when users unintentionally trigger a secondary action when navigating a touchscreen UI. It's usually because the icons are too close, or there's not enough padding to have separation within controls, or or even your call to action buttons. So the design recommendations here are for material design. The screenshot there. The recommended touch target size is to be a minimum of 48 pixels with at least an 8 pixel gap. So it just shows you, the different ways that you can have those icons or be it buttons and how you would want to size them. Another quick tip is, a great way to validate the user experience is to try the one thumb, one eyeball test. This test is about finding out if your design allows users to use your apps with just one hand and partially distracted attention. So you want to make sure that your users can perform a certain number of tasks with just one hand under 60 seconds. And if they're able to do that, then you know that you've covered for the fat finger syndrome, and you also covered for screens that require a lot of user interaction. All right. I do have one more tip on along the same pattern of having effective, an engaging user experience. The key to a good design is knowing how to control the flow for user. So when you build an app, you want to make sure that you place content and text in a way that captures the user's eye and makes it easier for them to navigate, particularly like when something as focused as a landing page. So there are two patterns here, the F pattern and the Z pattern. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those. The F pattern describes the way a person's eyes will move across a page that is dense with text, right? So our eyes are always trained to start at the top left corner, scan horizontally, and then drop down to the next line, and then do the same until we find something of interest. That's how our brains are wired. But before arranging the elements on your page, you want to prioritize the most important ones in a way that the users will see that and know those are the hotspots. So once you know what your users or once you know what you want your users to see, you can simply place them in the hotspots to ensure better user interactions. And then, place the most important content as near to the top of the page as possible so you can communicate the purpose of the page quickly. And then the user will usually read horizontally across the header. So that's always a good place for a navigation bar, for example. Now, when you prepare content for your website, it's always easy to assume that your site visitors will look at every part of the screen, but unfortunately, that's not really how users read. And you want to remember, users don't read; they scan, and that's what we do too as users. When you're on the consumption side as a consumer looking at a website, you scan; you're not reading. So a Z pattern design will trace the route of your human eye traveling when they're scanning the page. So it's left to right, top to bottom. And so when your viewers move or their eyes move in this pattern, it forms an imaginary Z shape. That's the example that we have there with the Facebook home screen. You see the Z pattern there. So, and as a designer, as app makers, we have a lot of control over, where people look and how we want to place controls and, what we want them to be focusing their attention on when they're viewing a screen. So ideally, you want people to see the most important information right from the start, and your first important information from the start, and then your next most information comes right below it. Um, so on the Z pattern example over there on the Facebook, you notice that point one is a starting point for the viewer's journey. It's a good look. It's always a good location to put your logos, for example. And then point two is you're placing items that you want the users to read first along the top of the Z. So that's where you have some login information, or maybe access important links, or maybe alerts and notifications that they need to be aware of. Maybe little icons that show you, hey, there are two alerts for you, or something like that. And then the purpose of point three is to guide the users to the call of action, which is at point four. So point four itself is the ideal place for your primary call to action, like your submit buttons or view buttons or any call to action buttons. And that's normally how we all build our apps. We drop them in the but then you could have scenarios where you want to separate out the experience. Maybe you could have a cancel button or you have several buttons. You are able to separate that by having your immediate call to action or your most commonly used call to action buttons on your bottom right corner, and then move any cancel or withdraw any buttons that are less commonly used towards the other extreme end of the screen. So that's just a quick tip on how you can incorporate some of those F and Z patterns when you are building your apps. And you probably are already, if you are, building apps. Some of them are pretty, just natural for us to place buttons and place logos and things like that. Just a little bit more knowledge on how users can help you, make sure that you place them accurately, so it's more intuitive for your users. Now we're coming over to our last set of tips. We've got two more tips. Now, we want to make sure that we're able to capture not just the UI and UX of it, but you want to make sure that you also make sure you have your performance of your apps as performant or as optimized as it can be. You could have the most marvelous looking app, but then performance wise, if it's slow or if it's lagging, it is going to take a hit in your adoption, and the experience is not going to be that good. So performance is key. You do want to make sure that you keep that in mind when you're designing your apps. Your number one tip there is to reduce complexity. You especially we're often tempted to load content on start of your app, right? We want to put on all the data sources. We want to pull all referential, all lookup data, everything at the start of the app. But it might not be necessary to do that at the start of the app every time, because you only want to load content that's relevant to the user at that point in time. There may be other screens in the app, maybe the users may not get to for that instance of the session. So if you could minimize the amount of data that you're pulling in on through the network on the load of your app. So that's something to keep in mind. If you can minimize that, that would be good practice. And so that way you are not keeping that experience of the user waiting while it's trying to load everything that may not necessarily be needed by that user at that point in time. Another way to speed up your queries is the concurrent function. What it basically does, it fires up threads of execution in parallel. So you could have unrelated independent calls to functions or data sources within a concurrent call. So you could have multiple of them in a single concurrent call. And then when Power Apps is rendering your screen and it sees a concurrent function, it knows that it doesn't have to wait sequentially to execute one after the other. It will, as soon as it sees a concurrent function, it knows that, okay, now I'm ready to fire them in parallel. So if you have 10 callouts, maybe you're getting data from different sources, you're doing some manipulation, or all of that can be within your concurrent function. It is going to fire 10 different threads and going to execute all of them at the same time. And that is why you want to make sure that you have independent calls. Like if there is a dependency on another one, waiting for another call to complete, you can do that. You want to make sure you use your concurrent function for any of those independent calls to data sources or any manipulation that you're doing. Another way to reduce complexity is to use static data source whenever possible. For example, one good example there would be, let's say you have multilingual app and there's a couple of screens and you want to, there's the different ways to do it too. You could use language translation services to do it as well. Another way to do it would be to have a static Excel file that has your controls with the actual translation of what those labels need to look like. For example, if you need a Spanish version of your app, you could have that in an Excel and load that Excel file as a static data source within your app. So at that point, what happens is it's cached locally, and when your app loads, it is not making a call to through the network to access a data store sitting in the cloud or any of your backend services, it can just look at what's available locally and just it'll make it much more performant. So anywhere that you see an opportunity for that, you don't want to use static data sources. Another very important concept in Canvas apps is delegation. If that is a new terminology for you, if you haven't looked at it before, I would highly recommend you have a good understanding of what delegation is. Delegation speaks to the expressiveness of Power Apps, of how it can delegate calls to your backend data source, or does it have to pull the entire data and do the data processing in-house within the app? There are a couple of delegable data sources like SQL, Dataverse, and that you do have a whole Microsoft Learn documentation that walks you through, even for those sources that are delegable, there are certain operators that may not be delegable. So you do want to make sure that you read through that to understand that you're not hitting any delegation limits, and you don't get those warnings. You'll see some of those blue lines under your Power Effect formula that you write, and that's tells you that, oh, you might be trying to make a call and it may not work well if you have larger data sets. Now that is your indication that it's a delegation issue. And also use the app checker and as a way for you to detect these issues, because it does tell you if those are not going to be performant and you're going to have delegation to be taken care of. Um, we talked about using SVGs. We already covered that piece. We talked about using HTML. And then just a couple of tips there, make sure there are several responsive containers and controls that you can use today to build responsive apps. Just so if you have a need for an app to use up a larger real estate, and you're wanting your controls to space based on the resolution, you can definitely make use of responsive app design. And then you want to make use of components. Components are packaged controls in a reusable module. So, for example, you could have a header control for your organization, which could be a component which has all of the bits in it packaged for you, and then have that deployed to your component library. So that way, the next time anyone else wants to create an app, they can grab that component and use it. And so there's a consistent look and feel in the apps. And that's just an example of one control. You could come up with several controls like that based on how frequently you're using it. If you see a need for one control being frequently used and being created from scratch again on every app, that's your sign that you want to create a component, or even within the same app. Like if you're having to recreate that for every screen or multiple screens in your app, componentize it. So that way you're not adding the number of controls that you are wanting to use in the app. You're keeping it pretty um, performant by reducing the number of controls that you're creating and using within the app. Um, Another good way to also group controls would be to, if you have long-running forms, for example, you have several fields in the forms, it is not a very intuitive experience for the user to be scrolling all the way, to be able to fill out the forms. You could use a tabbed layout. You could also use flyout menus to navigate the user, pretty much just help the user to know that there are sections of the form that you could fill out and be able to complete the task at hand. And sometimes it does help for a user to have a progressive way of working through content so they know there's achievable targets for them. Right, coming down to our last tip for the day, we want to still on the same theme of reducing complexity. We do want to limit the number of data connections you have. So hopefully you don't have apps that are more than 30 data sources in your app. And if you have a need for it, and if you see a need for connecting to 30 different data sources, then there might be a good opportunity for you to see how you can split the experience. Maybe the app needs to be split up into multiple apps, or maybe club some screens together in a single app and have maybe a home app or a landing app that launches to the other apps. So normally when you hit that limit, you will notice that your apps are not performing well. Your designer, your Power Apps Maker Studio will have trouble loading content, and you'll see intermittent issues. But that's your indicator to check, have I exceeded the number of data connections? And then also the number of controls. You want to make sure that you are staying within the 500 controls per app. It does add to the complexity of the app trying to render all of that on your browser. So that's something to keep in mind. And then a good way to try and minimize that complexity is to reuse controls wherever possible. So that example at the bottom there is a confirmation screen. So let's say I'm using that screen to provide a confirmation context after a user action, and that user action can happen on multiple screens in the app. So I'm using a single screen, reusing the same screen, but what I'm doing is having a global variable so I can show context or or data or text on that confirmation screen based on the role of the user, depending on which screen they're working on. So I don't have to create multiple confirmation screens. It's just a single screen, single control, but I am able to control what I want to show based on a global variable. So that is just another tip there for you to keep in mind when you are looking to create performant apps. That was all the tips that I had, but I did want to, do some call outs. I know Christine has a couple of sessions coming up next week. She is the design queen, and I'm super excited to see her sessions. And then she's going to have some mind-blowing content. And then, you have April, Al, and Yusuf, and I'm sure this slide does not do justice to all the amazing community app makers out there who have really cool, amazing designs. But this is just to give you a quick overview of how users have been making use of controls, creativity, templates, and inspirations to create apps that don't really need to look like how Power Apps controls are today. So a bunch of them over there. If you want to follow these folks on Twitter, feel free to follow them. They do have very good examples of how you can get inspired by watching things that they've built. And I hope you are able to use some of the tips that we've used today to continue to build some really cool apps in your journey. And I'm hoping this was very helpful. I am now happy to take any questions or any comments or anything that you would want to ask. All yours.
Yeah, I didn't see any questions here. Actually, there was one right from the get-go, people wanting to have your slides.
Yeah, we
So
can.
we'll share them with the team here. But this is very good. A lot of the stuff that we don't think about, and Microsoft does a great job of selling us that we can develop an app in 10 seconds. Of course, the app doesn't look as good as, as the ones that we see from you, from Christine, and from other folks from Leo. So this is very good. Um, if you have questions, you can post it on the chat or unmute yourself. Go for it.
Yeah, feel free to post any questions or, unmute and ask. I'm very happy to help.
Hi, Geetha. Thank you so much for a listening session. My name is Roxanne. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, we
Yes,
can hear
yes,
you.
we can.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm very new to Power Apps, and I'm very really basic. I'm getting to know the platform. I haven't made my first app, but I'm wondering, what is your top three things you wish you knew before you build your first Canvas app?
Oh, all of these tips that I share are things that wish I knew when I, first started. These are things that I kind of just, made note of for myself, like when I started building it, and that's what we've used. But yes, I think delegation is number one. That's definitely something that you don't know as an. I come from a pro code background, but still the concept of delegation is a little different when you get into the Power Platform world, and especially for even for those who don't come from coding background. It's the whole concept of understanding how your data source works and what you can delegate your data source to process your queries and how much can Power App handle. So that's something that you really want to read up on, if you're going to get started, because you're going to start building apps and building queries, and then when your data grows, you're going to see implications in your app because it's not going to be able to talk to your data source. So you should be proactive about making your queries delegable and using the right combination of form operators and logic, so that way you don't hit that for that's definitely there. And then also using reusable components like Creator Kit, coming up with component libraries. These are things that make it very productive for you when you start building the apps because you are not wanting to, build everything from scratch. A lot of times, I've started building apps and then you build a header control and then you're having to copy paste that header control for every screen because you want it to show up. And then you realize that, oh, your colleagues are doing the same thing. And then it just makes sense to have your controls componentized. So that way, the next time you build an app, you don't have to spend the time to do it. It's low code. That's the whole concept of you're not having to write any code to do things. It's just more of Power Platform, Power FX code that you're writing. But it
Mhm.
helps you to package them so that not only you can use it, but you're able to share it and everybody else in your team can use it as well. So definitely that's something to, work through. And then just reading through there's a Microsoft doc on the different Power FX functions that you can use. I always give that as a tip. I've there have been times that I have that whole screen open and it lists all the functions from A to Z with examples of how each function is used. So if it's a patch function, you will see examples of how that's being used. That's also a good way to, so you're not scrambling to figure out, okay, I know how to get this to work, but I don't know what function to
Mhm.
use. Just have that open
Exactly.
so
Hmm.
you can go open that up and you can just search for a keyword and in on that screen and you will see an existing function for it. So and my fourth tip would be utilize the community forums. You have
Hmm.
the Power Apps user forums, so you never know, there may already be someone who already has an answer for an issue that you've already been working on, or you could go post a question and the next time someone else has this issue, they will have an answer for it. Majority of the times you will see that these are common issues. There have been people who already asked for it. So use the community forums to ask, to share, and also to search for content for any issues that you may have faced.
Hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah,
Welcome.
well, I think it's just the coding that's a little bit overwhelming for me, but I think it will come through the power of ethics language. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'll remember.
Yeah, no,
Thank
well,
you.
think of it as Excel. Like, don't when you come and get into Power Apps, think of it like you're working with Excel and PowerPoint. I think I have to quote April here. I think in one of her sessions, she said it's like Excel and PowerPoint had a baby. Like, it's merging both the services and how they work. So a lot of those Excel-based formula and things that you work with are applicable here. Maybe little tweaks here and
Mhm.
there on how things work, but when you start looking at it, think like, how would you do it in Excel? Okay, these are my macros, these are my functions that I'm going to use, and you're able to do it. It makes it a little more easier to just shift the way you think when you start building apps.
Sure, that's a great mindset. I'll try to have that in mind. Thank you so much.
All right. I think we have one more question from Leo. He's asking if you have any tips to check how many controls are currently being used in an app.
Yes, there is a another Power App template. It's called the Power Apps monitoring. I'll find the link and I'll post it in the chat, Leo. But that is an app. I think it's called Power Apps Checker or Power Apps Performance Monitoring or something like that. That you can download. It's on GitHub, and I'll post a link to it. That you can download, and you are able to have that app does the job of checking your app. Like you could pick which app you want to run a check against, and then it'll show you everything, like places that you can have improvements on. It'll give you warnings, a delegation, and it'll also show you, I think it does show you how many controls, or at least it'll tell you like, this screen has way more controls than it can use. So I will be sure to drop that link. I'll find that and drop it.
Awesome. Thank you. So I have a challenge for everyone who's on the call and wants to do some homework. You can take the lesson from Chris last week, where he goes through database design using an Excel artifact as input, and then you can build a Canvas app applying everything that Geetha explained today. I know it's going to be a huge homework. I don't know how much time you have, on your week, and it's already Tuesday. But if you want to get started on that, it would be good. And if you have anything to showcase next week, we can take a few minutes from the beginning of next week's lesson and just showcase your work. All right. Thank you so much, Geeta. Thanks everybody who is on the call, and we'll see you on Thursday. Take care.
Hey, thanks
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Geetha.
Bye bye.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank